We now join the CBS television network. The program is in progress.
But now, what's the next agenda? Well, the next agenda is for the tobacco companies to say, well, let's wrap this thing. Let's wrap this rogue in the clothing of civil rights, because everybody cherishes civil rights. And that's the problem as I see it. With this thing is like Lewis Carroll said, things are not always what they seem. On the surface, this is a plea for privacy, and that's what people are after. We protect our privacy. Don't tell us what we can do at home. But recognize, at the same time, you're sanctifying something that you know accounts for a major portion of this nation's health debt. Know that you're dealing with the thing that accounts for the major amount of downtime in industry.
All right, we should let Willie Brown answer that. Is the tobacco industry itself really the ones behind this that are trying to...
Well, I'm not suggesting the tobacco industry is behind it, not behind it, but I think that I'm opposed. First of all, I don't smoke, and I'm against smoking. I know how detrimental smoking could be. I would support legislation that would address that issue. This legislation does not address that issue, and I would argue that people stand more of a chance of having a heart attack with the fact they are smokers than to go to find out they have lost their jobs. They're only going to smoke more, you know, because they'll become more frustrated. So I'm suggesting that the veto does not address the problem. I would support legislation that would address the problem. And we need to have a mechanism to protect people's rights from working. You know, the fact that they have been discriminated against for employment is really my concern. I think that's what we have to address. I'm not suggesting what degree that it should be as it relates to civil rights. I think there is a need to have some legislation attacked to protect those individuals. You know, the fact that we tax cigarettes. I mean, if tobacco is so bad, then we should make it illegal to sell tobacco. We shouldn't... A lot of our revenue comes from tobacco, so it's an accepted social practice in society. You know, if it's that bad, then let's do away with it.
Okay, both of you gentlemen, please stay with us. Night Watch will continue in just a moment, and we'll continue this discussion about smokers' rights. And we're continuing our discussion on smokers' rights. Assemblyman Brown, wouldn't
let me make a point, you know, in reference to, I would be curious to find out, I know a lot of doctors smoke, a lot of them smoke cigars. How many of them would feel comfortable if they went to the hospital and the hospital said you can no longer practice medicine here because you're a smoker? You know, I mean, you know, those are people, I'll be curious to find out their position.
You've had a chance to think about that one. Dr. Tansey, why don't you answer that?
You know, I think that this issue has to be dealt with, not at the level of a civil right. This is written in a civil rights code for which there's no exclusion.
Well, is it a health issue or is it a civil rights issue? Or is it both?
From my point of view, as a practicing doc, it's a health issue. I mean, I deal on a daily basis with people. I mean, Coop's statistics show that 4 out of 5 people who smoke want to stop smoking. I could verify that from my practice. I want to help people get off of tobacco. I understand that some people are addicted to tobacco. I understand they need help, and that's why the American Heart Association is there to help people not smoke. But when you look at the statistics, over the last 10 years, the death from cardiovascular diseases in the nation has dropped 25%. Now, one of the most powerful tools in all of that is prevention. And I would like to boast that the American Heart accounts for a lot of that effort with all our volunteers. So we're out there teaching people that this substance is going to increase your chance of a stroke by 5, increase your chance of a heart attack by 3, and yet at the same time we're teaching this to the kids in the school with our school site initiatives. Our assembly is saying, well, smoking is a civil right. It sounds wrong. It doesn't feel right. I mean, I understand people's need of choice, and when I speak to a patient, I don't say, listen, if you don't stop smoking, I'll never see you again. I say, listen, here's some tricks. Here's some, understand, if you're going to smoke at home, you're making a choice, but understand the choice you're making. So while I'm making all this preventive health initiative, I'm countered by my biggest adversary, or the Heart Association's biggest adversary, is the Tobacco Institute, which spends $10 million a day marketing the most deadly product that our nation has.
See, then I think if that's the case, then we should talk about legislation that prohibits marketing. I mean, we should talk about legislation that addresses those issues, which I don't have any real problems with. My thing is that's discrimination. I don't think we should have the kids growing up to say that, you know, you can be denied of a job based on various social practice when they know that the most detrimental thing is probably using illegal drugs, cocaine and things of that nature. There are no ads in the paper saying drug addicts need not apply, but you just, you know, they're singling out smokers. And I would question that if we all agree that there are social problems, but we need to come together collectively and figure out how to address that. This legislation, you know, does not deal with any of those things that you talked about, which I would support. You know, we could talk about a way to arrive at that.
Well, let's talk for a second about what the tobacco companies are trying to cast themselves as. As you know, the protectors of liberty, as an example, the Philip Morris Company recently ran a series of ads embracing the Constitution. Do you think that that set the stage for what's happening right now in New Jersey and other state legislatures?
I don't think the two are related. I think that I think any company would embrace the Constitution. The fact that they're business practicing in this country, that's what the whole capitalistic society is about.
But I mean, visually implying that you have a constitutional right to smoke.
Well, I think you do until we do a constitutional amendment to say you don't have. You know, I would think that people have a right to do whatever. That's the right of privacy. I think it created that. People have a right to drink alcohol, you know, but there's no sign saying because you drink alcohol, you will not be hired. So it's a question, where do we stop? You know, the alcohol industry probably would do the same thing, I guess. I haven't seen them, you know, embrace
Do you agree with that, Dr. Tanzi, that you have a constitutional right to smoke?
I think you have a constitutional right to do what you want to do. I don't think at this time you need to select out one substance. You talk about alcohol, you talk about smoking, talk about eating ice cream. That's cholesterol containing. Are we going to make a law that says you can't eat ice cream at home? No, we're not saying that. We're saying, and I'll repeat, that the difference between the drugs and the tobacco is the drugs are illegal, the tobacco by accident of history is legal.
Which is the fallacy that if that's the problem, that's what we need to correct.
Well, you know, I can certainly agree with that. I mean,
we need to talk about a constitutional amendment to make smoking illegal.
The tobacco industry is the only unregulated industry in our country.
Okay, what happened here? There was a tremendous effort to get people to stop smoking, and it seems now the pendulum is swinging the other way. What's happening?
I think there's still an effort. I support the effort to get people to stop smoking because I know it's detrimental. I personally don't like smoke, and I like, you know, to be around smokers. So I can, you know, I empathize with people as a smoker rights. We support, you know, employers, non-smoke. We passed legislation, no smoking in public places. I was a proponent. I supported that position. I still do. But I think it's two different issues.
Do you think that some employers and companies have crossed the line when they say, we won't hire you?
Absolutely.
Is that your
Absolutely. That's my concern, and I see that as a mechanism to continue discrimination that I've experienced and a lot of my constituents have experienced down through the years, and there's nothing to protect them. If we could come up with some kind of legislation to protect those individuals, then I'll be satisfied.
All right, we have 30 seconds, gentlemen. What will happen? Will Governor Florio's measure, will it be overridden?
Well, I'm in a position now to try to work out a solution so that everyone can be on board and everyone can be supportive of the legislation, including the Heart Association and all those other smoker rights, the citizens that smoke. As long as they're all protected, then I have no problem. That's my objective.
Okay. We'll be right back in just a moment. Please stay with us. And we're back talking about the issue of smokers' rights. As both of you gentlemen know, legislatures across the country are now introducing bills that would give smokers' rights. Do you think this is a growing movement?
I don't know if it's a growing movement or not. I think it's a growing movement probably on employers, on industries now finding another loophole for whatever reason they've had in the past. They can be very selective. I could see them saying we don't women in this workplace and use smoking as an excuse not to hire them as they've done in the past. They can use other reasons to do that. You know, use smoking for reasons not to hire for whatever reason. I mean, a person can be obese. You know, that's unhealthy. If they're an alcoholic, that's unhealthy. They drive reckless. That could be unhealthy. That could increase the insurance rates and all those issues. So I think that we need to probably look at, you know, the problem and deal with the solution rather than use this particular issue as the bad guy.
All right, let's try to find the middle ground then. If I understand both your positions correctly, Assemblyman Brown, you say that smokers should have rights as far as the workplace, and they should not be discriminated against as far as hiring.
That's right. And employers also should have the right to say they should not smoke on the workplace.
The workplace, limited to the workplace.
Right.
And of course, Dr. Tenzer, you feel smoking is bad for your health and a host of other reasons. Where's the middle ground in all this?
Well,
is there any middle ground?
oh, sure, there's a middle ground, because Assemblyman Brown mentioned his own interest in us trying to find. I mean, what are we both trying to do? We're trying to create a sense of well-being for people. We're trying to protect them from illness. But we're dealing with all of these other things that by turning this bill about smoking in the workplace into a civil rights issue, we elevate it way out of the range that it ought to be. It ought to be down, and maybe we ought to assemble different specific cases and work on them. But it's clearly to the tobacco company's advantage to polarize us, to make it just strictly a privacy issue, because we're all for privacy. And if they can successfully make it a privacy, then we can forget about the fact that the small employer that wants to buy health insurance has to pay more health insurance. I mean, in a sense, that's a discriminator against the non-smoker, because whereas health insurance now has a smoker's discount, a non-smoker's discount, you can't ask the question anymore. If the bill goes through, insurance companies are one of the things listed in the bill. They can't ask the question on whether or not you smoke. Well, golly, if so much heart disease and so much lung disease and so much upper respiratory illness is the result of this substance, we shouldn't call this something that can be protected as a civil right. It gets to be the camel's nose under the tent. If this sneaks in innocently now as a civil right under the guise of we want to protect your right to smoke, then the next thing we're going to do is revisit all our clean air legislation, because we have a civil right now. And we have to say, well, listen, we can't have the anti-discrimination in these public places. And then we have this great groundswell, and we set aside all the wonderful things I think we've accomplished.
I think the civil rights only comes in as a factor as it relates to employment. Well, my legislation only talks about employment, you know, and that's the issue. I don't know how you separate employment, the right to have a job, away from various civil rights. That should be a civil rights to employment. Now, it does not talk about, you know, pro-smokers, you know, and it does not preclude people from addressing those other issues. You know, if you smoke on the job, you can get fired. This bill does not take that away. So it still recognizes the kinds of progress we made as relates to smoking in public places and other issues. This bill does not take away any of those things that we've done.
Do you think your bill would make the tobacco industry happy?
Well, I don't know if they'd be happy, they'd be unhappy. I don't see how it's related to marketing. You know, my bill talks about discrimination now. I don't know if, see, my argument is that if the bill is vetoed, as the bill is vetoed by the government, if it does not becomes law, how many people tomorrow will stop smoking? So this bill does not, in law, out of law, does not stop people from smoking, which I think the doctors are concerned about, which I'm concerned about. So it's two different issues. That's the point I'm making. If I thought tomorrow, if the bill being dead, that 1,000 people were going to stop smoking, then I probably would make sure, you know, I'd be on that side.
I think that...
Can you guarantee me that once the bill is dead, that day, people at that point will start not to smoke or stop smoking?
Well, let me follow up on that, because one of the ways that the bill is wound up being portrayed, which is a far departure from what I'm sure you originally intended, is it's interpreted now that voting against this bill now, I'm sorry, voting in favor of the bill is voting for privacy. Voting against the bill is the automatic legislation that you can't smoke at home. It's turning...
Well, that's what it does.
No, it doesn't. The absence of the bill would be the best, because we have all these hard-at-work initiatives,
for example. The bill would allow employers to discriminate to people that smoke. They would not have to hire them. There's no protection.
The absence of the bill would allow employers to participate in a problem that is going to impact on... You see, I think when an employer hires somebody, they ought to be responsible for the total person.
But I don't think they should be able to single out a social practice that's accepted by society.
Well, the bill singles out one. It singles out smoking as opposed to alcohol, as opposed to ice cream.
Employers created the problem. They're the ones now that are advertising that smokers need not apply. They created the problem.
But there's absolutely no exclusion in this bill. Even in the rest of the bill to which it's attached when it talks of sex, it makes exclusions. There are certain things where women would not work and men would work.
The bill says that the legislation that addresses smoking in public places and others still should be protected. That's in the bill.
But it doesn't allow that a chemical firm, for example, which just can't deal with people who smoke at home or at work because it affects chemically what they do, they can't exclude them. It can't exclude the firemen whose exercise tolerance is diminished because they smoke on the outside.
But what's interesting, they don't even advertise that non-smokers only and smokers should not apply. Those industries, I would say those unscrupulous industries that want to use this, that have always discriminated probably, and they are now using this as a mechanism. And those industries like chemicals, I don't think there will ever be a case. I think people will respect that. I don't think anyone would bring a suit against that because we all recognize a certain prudence that companies must practice.
I think, because I've seen, I mean, you're sufficiently creative to take the reasons why they do it. It's not an arbitrary, it isn't as if we have a great big anti-smoking campaign. Why these industries suggest that people don't smoke and turn that into positive, let's get health awareness programs. When we're trying to do that in Newark now.
Exactly.
With cholesterol, let's do it with high blood pressure, let's do it with smoking, let's do it with exercise. But now, you see, if this is a civil right, you could see that smoking education programs within the industry for the purpose of wellness would be disallowed.
I think we are probably, I'm amenable to adjusting the degree as it relates to civil rights, that issue. I have no problem with that. But I think those industries, I would ask you, have they been supportive of the heart associations, those industries that are saying that smokers need not apply? I would like to look at their track record to find out how much they've contributed to preventing cancer and that whole issue.
Okay.
I think
Gentlemen, obviously, this debate is going to go on and on smokers' rights, and we'll be hearing a lot more about this issue, and I'm sure in the days and months ahead. I'd like to thank both you gentlemen for joining us here on Night Watch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is TV8, KCCI-TV, Des Moines.
The citizens of Iraq face a grim situation, and it's getting worse by the day. The Allied bombing campaign has left the country without electricity, safe drinking water, or sewage treatment facilities. There is also a shortage of food, and intestinal infections are on the rise. Officials say the conditions are ripe for massive outbreaks of disease. Joining us from New York is Richard Reed, the Regional Middle East Director for UNICEF. He was the co-chairman of a team of health professionals who spent 5 days in Iraq earlier this month. Welcome, Mr. Reed, to Night Watch.
Thanks. Good to be here.
How would you describe the situation in Iraq right now?
Well, when we left 3 days ago, the city itself was cold, smoky, tattered, just about paralyzed. The health situation is as you depicted it just now. We're terribly worried about the possible outbreak of epidemics, particularly such things as cholera, typhoid, or meningitis. And it's something that we're keeping our fingers crossed over. The cool weather that we're having right now in Baghdad is very favorable. That is, it's keeping the possibility of epidemics down. But within 5 or 6 weeks, we're going to find ourselves at temperatures around 100 degrees. And at that time, if something isn't done, we will have outbreaks of epidemic that will make what's happening now in Peru seem like nothing at all.
Well, you say unless something is done. What should be done?
One thing, there should be gotten into Iraq something to start the water treatment plants again. There are 7 of them in Baghdad, and all of the water that comes into homes comes from the Tigris River. These 7 plants treat the Tigris River. They have no chemicals, neither aluminum sulfate or chlorine, nor do they have any electricity. If something could be done to get them started again so that they could produce about 40 liters of water a day, then I think that would bring us to standards that would be livable. Also, we would like to get the health system going again. It's collapsed completely. This means that vaccinations aren't protecting kids. We face the prospect in Iraq and in a number of other countries in the region of what I would characterize as a lost generation of children.
All right, whose responsibility is it to get these things done?
Originally, it's the responsibility of the government. But right now, the government is in disarray, and so is most of Iraqi society. Therefore, the international organizations will have to step in one way or another. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, or one or several of the UN organizations. And the Iraqis are ready to cooperate with this.
All right, you're certainly not saying that the United States should have this responsibility.
Oh, I think it's just an international responsibility now, but one that can probably be best carried out through the international organizations.
All right, what's the most threatening problem right now, the most serious problem of all?
Well, the most serious is certainly the epidemic problem. The second most serious is the collapse of the health system. And the third, the scarcity of food. And the food supply is dwindling all the time.
You visited the countryside in Baghdad. What were the conditions like, and what did you see when you went to the countryside?
The countryside was just about the same as Baghdad. At the start of the war, a lot of people expected that conditions in the hinterland would be better. This was the expectation of a lot of Iraqis, and so they left Baghdad in droves, over 1 million of them. However, by the time we were there, they were returning because they found conditions out in the villages and smaller towns even worse.
The children. Tell us about the children. How were they coping with this?
The children are having a rough time for a number of reasons. One of them is tremendous fear and anxiety, the same syndrome we've seen, especially in Beirut. Second, none of the things that they've counted on can be counted on anymore. And their parents are in terrific anxiety. Food is hard to come by. The kids are now eating a totally different diet from what they had before. And they can't go to the clinic or the dispensary when they fall ill. So all of these things are besetting kids now.
Did you actually see any cases of epidemic disease?
No, there weren't any reported, but a lot of this, I think, is simply because the reporting system, the sentinel system that looks out for these diseases, has broken down and not been functioning since September. We're pushing hard now to get that going again, to get in the kinds of laboratory reagents and equipment, the basic stuff that's needed to get the laboratories that test these things and cause the red lights to flash, so to speak, on the dashboard to start working again.
How much time, how long do you give it before these epidemic diseases do break out?
I would say not more than 4 or 5 weeks. Within that time, if something hasn't happened, it will be a biblical miracle. But we can't count on that, that's for sure. Right now, the people of Baghdad are getting virtually all of their water from the Tigris River, which is at once a well, a bathing place, and a latrine. And we know that the human fecal count in the river is exceedingly high. It's a miracle that there hasn't been an outbreak, a serious one up to now. And one of the things that we told the Iraqi officials was that they needed to prioritize this water supply problem and give it as high priority as the prosecution of the war, that there would be far more people dying from these epidemic diseases if they broke out than from the bombardment.
Richard Reed, Regional Middle East Director for UNICEF, thank you so much for joining us, and Night Watch will continue in just a moment.
You're welcome. Now, here is CBS News correspondent Frank Courier.
As we struggle to live our daily lives, every species in the animal kingdom is doing the same thing. In the animal world, predators are foiled, food is gathered, rivals are fought, mates selected, and then, just as in the human world, it all begins again with the next generation. David Attenborough, one of the world's best-known natural scientists, has devoted his life to investigating the fascinating lives of animals. His previous books and television programs, Life on Earth and The Living Planet, explore how animals' bodies work. His new work is called The Trials of Life, a natural history of animal behavior. It is the final book in the trilogy, and it explores the way animals use their bodies, the way they behave. Sir David Attenborough is with us. Welcome.
Thank you.
How does your third book in the trilogy differ from the others, talking about behavior?
Well, when we started the trilogy, I was a bit worried as to whether we were going to be able to make it, really, because we were going to travel the entire world, and we were going to cover the entire animal kingdom. So we were a bit cautious. If we got a shot of a lemur, it didn't matter if it was asleep, at least it was a lemur. But now we went for the big one. We went for the one that all the animals, where it's all action, and that was quite a problem.
Conflict, that seems to be a significant aspect of all animal behavior. The search for food, the fighting between animals. We have a video clip from your upcoming documentary that'll air this June, I understand. And it involves, let's see, South American sea lions off the coast of Patagonia.
Oh, yeah.
And a killer whale. Why don't we take a look at that?
These are South American sea lions off the coast of Patagonia. They can't give birth to their babies while they're swimming, as whales and dolphins do. Instead, they have to come ashore to do so. And here, in dense groups, moving awkwardly between land and sea, they're a great temptation to any hunter that can reach them. Their nursery beach seems secure. On the landward side, there are steep cliffs, and on the other side, the beach is protected by the sea. But the sea itself can harbor enemies. A killer whale, 30 feet long, 8 tons in weight. Every year, the same group of about a dozen of them assemble off the sea lion nursery to hunt. For sea lions to venture into deep water here is very dangerous indeed. It's much safer to stay in the shallows if they can.
What happens when the killer whale catches the sea lions?
They thrash it from side to side, and while it's still alive, they then manage to get back into the sea, the whale does, and when it's out at sea, he then plays with this sea lion pup. It throws it up in the air, it comes out, hits it with the fluke of its tail. The poor animal, the poor seal falls into the sea, the killer whale goes beneath and then comes up and catches it again in its jaws. It's just like a cat playing with a mouse, and no one knows why.
Nobody knows why.
No why.
Do all animals seem to have some sense of social sense? I mean, is there something social about them? When elephants are born, other elephants in the herd tend to help out and they join in, or the opposite?
Not all. I mean, the variation is enormous. Orangutan, for example, that big ape in Borneo, is a very solitary animal. He's grumpy as hell. I mean, the male doesn't want to see anybody else at all except briefly the female. And when they've mated, he disappears and he goes back to a lonely life. So there's every variation.
Well, it seems, take a mother bat, for example. She'll go into the cave and there may be scores, a whole crowd of baby bats, all hungry and squealing. The mother bat will go only to her own child. Right?
Well, it used to be thought that that was impossible, because after all, there are a million baby bats in one of these creches, in one of these caves, for example, and when a mother comes back, here these little things are naked, the size of sort of small plums, hanging on the roof. How can she possibly find her baby? She's got milk and the babies have to be fed. Then what happens? And for many, many years, everybody thought, well, the baby's just a suckle from the first mother that landed. Now, because we've been able to take genetic fingerprinting of both the baby and the mother, we can prove that the mother actually finds her own baby every time. It's quite extraordinary. She does it by listening to its call.
Animals also have found some of the most ingenious solutions for finding food, have they not? What would be an example?
Well, it depends, of course, what food you're talking about. The killer whales found a fairly ingenious way of getting sea lions, but everything has obviously to feed. But even those simple problems like feeding on leaves, or indeed seeds, is a great problem, because plants don't relish to have their leaves destroyed or their nuts consumed, and they protect them with poisons, all sorts of things. But parrots have learned how to take a nut that's got poison in it, eat it, and then go and find a special medicine, which they find in a rare earth, which is on a riverbank, and eat that kaolin in order to absorb the poison from the food. Extraordinary.
In one chapter, Finding the Way, you show how some animals employ very innovative methods in navigating. That some animals would use the stars, or they would use, eels would use their electric voltage. Give us a few examples of that.
One of the most extraordinary ways of finding a way, and difficult to find a way, is in an environment that has no signposts at all. Say, for example, the sands of the Sahara. If you're an ant, there is no way that you can see, no permanent landmark that you can have. And there is one ant that has to get out, comes out in the middle of the day when it's very hot, and it zigzags around looking for food, perhaps a dead insect. And when it's got its food, it has to get back to its burrow directly, as quickly as possible. And it's able to do that because every time it makes a zigzag, it looks up at the sun, it does a 360-degree turn, it registers what its route is, and at the end of maybe 20 or 30 of those turns, it has done all the calculations so that it knows in which direction its hole lies, and it goes straight back.
How long did it take you to figure out something like this?
Well, I didn't figure it out, but there are scientists all over the world who are working on these kind of problems, and fortunately, they tell you.
We'll be back in just a minute to talk some more David Attenborough on Night Watch. Stay with us. Welcome back to Night Watch. We're with David Attenborough. We were talking a moment ago about how various animals navigate, and we have an example of the spiny lobster in the shallow waters off the Bahamas, and how they link together in an effort to find their way, and we have an example of that.
In the calm, shallow seas of the Bahamas live spiny lobsters. Lobsters like calm, clear water. But in autumn, the Bahamas are swept by serious storms. Suddenly, as the waters become more and more cloudy, the lobsters decide to move and seek refuge at greater depths. Start in the evening, traveling in pairs. By morning, the pairs have joined into long columns. In queues 30 or 40 strong, they head for the drop-off on the ocean side of the lagoon. It seems that they know the way from the overall direction of current and swell, which remains constant at this depth.
Just incredible footage.
The amazing thing, when you come to think of it, is why do they bother to form those long queues? Why don't they just go? And it seems that the logic they have is exactly the same as the wagon trains crossing the West, that they are preyed upon by parrotfish. And if they stick together, they can defend themselves. If a parrotfish comes along, the queues break up, and they form a circle, just like the wagons, you know, with the Indians around them, with those spiky antennae sticking out, and the parrotfish can't get at them. And so it pushes off, and then they go back again. But if one gets isolated, the parrotfish will go down, get hold of the spike, and you can hear it. It breaks the spike off and then dismembers the lobster.
When you go out to film something like this, do you go out with this in mind, that this is what I'm going to get, or is it all just luck?
Oh no, no luck at all. Hardly any luck anyway. No. All these programs were written a 30 or 40 page script for each one before we even started filming, so we know exactly what we want. And in any case, you see, if you went and had just luck for going to the lobsters, it only happens on 2 days, 3 days of the year. So you have to know that that's what you're going for.
Animals fight over food, they fight over territory, they fight over mating as well. What species seem to be some of the most violent, some of the most destructive in this process?
Perhaps one of the most formidable of all are things like army ants. Army ants, where you've got 1 million ants living in one particular colony, and which will move through the forests of South America, eating everything that stays in their path. There's nothing that if you had a dog and you had left it tied to a tree, the ants would kill the dog out of sheer shock, because 1,000 bites from an army ant is enough to shock the animal and kill it. So they're pretty formidable. And they're the one things that I suppose, the one hunters that really always win. Most other hunters, surprisingly, we tend to show on television, we always show the successful hunts. We always show the lion, which is knocking over the wildebeest. If you start trying to film lions knocking over wildebeest, you discover that again and again and again they fail. And the life of a lion hunting wildebeest is a tough one. They have to get it just right, and maybe they will go for several days without success.
Now, the grizzly bear, I remember reading, has no fear? There's no fear at all there? Does that
Oh, it isn't true to say it hasn't got any fear, because one of your safety measures you can have is to take a thunder flash or a big bang. I mean, they don't like a lot of noise. So, no, they can be scared off. But I mustn't propose to be an expert on grizzly bears, but they are certainly very formidable animals, and they can run very fast, and they're one of the few animals that regard human beings as a nice meal, as natural prey.
How do animals talk to strangers? How do they get their signals out to others in ways we don't understand?
Well, of course, communication between ourselves, between the same species, and this colobus monkey talking to another colobus monkey is one problem. The interesting thing is that on occasion animals have to talk to a different species. And there are well-known signals that an animal will use when it talks to another animal altogether. There's a bird, for example, which talks deliberately to human beings and will tell human beings where honey is in order that the bird can get a friend to open the honey nest in order to get the honey out of it, which the bird itself can't do. And there's an elaborate communication between the honey-guide bird and an African tribesman.
Are we learning anything new about communication, or has most of this been known and we're just documenting?
No, there's an awful lot we don't know about animal communication. We simply don't understand. For example, we still really don't understand how squid talk to one another, which they certainly do, and have a very elaborate language. We're still working out how dolphins talk to one another and have a much more elaborate system of communication than we thought.
Talk a bit about animal courtship behaviors. These run the gamut, don't they? I mean, there's not... your book had some interesting pictures as well to go with that.
Yes, of course, the courtship, the problem about courtship, as we all know, is how to get close to your mate without them getting upset about it. And if you are an animal that has a very powerful weapons, that is a hunter, let us say, the danger is that as the male approaches female, the female may think that what she's getting is breakfast as against a lover. So you have to, say you're a spider, a male spider is nearly always smaller than the female spider, and he has to communicate with her very, very carefully to make sure that he's not eaten. And he will do it by all kinds of ways. He does it with semaphore, with one species does it with its feelers. Another one actually twangs the web, the silken web, and sends us a particular signal which says, doing, I'm not a fly, I'm your friend, and then eventually it gets close. And if he gets it wrong, of course, there's real trouble.
Thank you so much for joining us. Best wishes on your new book and documentary. We'll be back in just a moment.
And that's our broadcast for this Thursday. Coming up later this week, we'll look at the first wave of so-called crack babies to enter the nation's kindergartens. A new study of them came up with some unexpected results. We'll also talk about a plan to engage an army of lawyers as bounty hunters, private attorneys commissioned by the government to go after the swindlers in the S&L crisis. And we'll enter the fascinating world of the gypsies with the music of gypsy jazz guitar virtuoso Borelli Legren. Until then, for everyone here at Nightwatch, I'm Harold Dow in Washington.
This is KCCI, TV8 in Des Moines.
This morning on Nightwatch, Bush halts the Gulf offensive.
Soon, we will open wide our arms to welcome back home to America our magnificent fighting forces.
The future in the Middle East.
One can see an Arab-Israeli war based on the Palestine question with world opinion not on our side. Not on our side, because the number of states which believe that the West Bank and Gaza should be permanently incorporated in Israel, do you know what that number is? It is 0.
Mating is tricky in the animal world.
If you are an animal that has a very powerful weapons, that is a hunter, let us say, the danger is that as the male approaches female, the female may think that what she's getting is breakfast, as against a lover.
Also, lighting a legislative fire under smokers. And a powerful message from dance. Now in Washington, here is CBS News correspondent Harold Dow.
One of the biggest tragedies of the Vietnam War was the way some veterans were treated when they returned home. There was no hero's welcome for the servicemen who had waged such an unpopular and divisive war. Many Vietnam veterans have suffered as a result. National sentiment toward the Gulf is much more positive. Local and national leaders want to capitalize on that to make sure veterans are well treated when they return home. How are the Desert Storm veterans likely to cope after the war? And is the Department of Veteran Affairs ready for them? 3 people join us now to look at these questions and others surrounding the homecoming of U.S. troops from the Gulf. Edward Derwinski is Secretary of the Department of Veteran Affairs. John Summer is the Executive Director of the American Legion and a specialist on post-traumatic stress disorder. And Mary Stout is a former Vietnam War nurse and is head of the Vietnam Veterans of America. I'd like to welcome you all to Nightwatch. First of all, Mr. Derwinski, let's start with you. What will happen to the veterans when they do return home from Desert Storm?
Well, first, from a standpoint of their benefits, medical services, we hope we're ready. Those that will require medical services, we're ready to give them priority in our hospitals. Those that will qualify now for additional benefits as veterans will be expeditiously handled. We think that's a special challenge and responsibility, and we at the VA hope to meet it.
Your job is now a cabinet-level post. Does that mean, can one read or deduce from that the government now will give the veterans the priority, a higher priority than they've ever had before?
No, Harold. I think that there was a very high priority immediately after World War II, and that resulted in all the historic legislation, the original GI Bill and so forth. There was I think, a fair priority after Korea. I remember that myself. And then, as everyone would agree, there was a lack of priority to veterans coming home from Vietnam. This time, I think the country is ready. The government will be ready, and the fact that we're a department enhances our ability to draw cooperation and support from the rest of government. But it's the country that is supporting the veteran, and that's the key.
Okay, there's been a ground roots effort, in addition to the fact that the government now has been involved in making sure that there is a tremendous welcoming for the Vietnam veterans. What do you think it will be like when they come home?
Well, everyone is going out of their way to make sure that these veterans are welcome, as opposed to, as you mentioned earlier, what happened to a lot of Vietnam veterans. The American Legion is developing a program now where Vietnam veterans will sort of adopt the Persian Gulf veterans as a big brother and give them the advice from their experience as to what they need to do and to talk over their war situation, because they'll be talking with veterans who have already been there.
All right, Mary Stout, you were a nurse in Vietnam. How important is it for the veterans to have a big welcome when they come home?
I think it's very important. I think we see a big difference in the attitude about themselves personally from particularly World War II veterans. Korean veterans feel they didn't get the welcome. We hear that very often, that they didn't get that kind of welcome home, and Vietnam veterans certainly didn't. I think when you look at the very large veterans organizations, there's a lot of World War II veterans who are very active in them, who feel, you know, a great sense of pride about their military service. That's something we lost during the Vietnam era particularly, that sense of pride in what we did as members of the military, because it was questioned, was it the right thing to do? I think what's going on in the Persian Gulf, many Vietnam veterans are feeling kind of mixed emotions about, yes, this homecoming is going to be very different, but very proud that in fact we maybe had to go through that period of what happened to Vietnam veterans to let the American public understand how important it is that we don't let these people down. And so while it's kind of bittersweet, it feels very good that that lesson has been learned, that the support for the troops is there and it's going to be there. Our concern now, I think, and all of us need to be concerned, is what happens 2 years afterwards. You know, are there going to be problems that we're not aware of now that need to be addressed? And that's where all of us who deal in veterans issues have to continue to be alert, to continue to watch for what are the long-term needs. I think the short-term needs are being addressed and will be addressed well, and with the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense and the veterans organizations and the whole community. What happens longer down the line is of concern.
All right, Mr. Derwinski, I'm sure the Veterans Affairs had prepared for the worst, and obviously the way things have been going right now in the war in the Gulf, extremely well for the American troops and the Allies. Sophisticated weapons, I'm sure, had a lot to do with that. What were you prepared for?
We were prepared for, theoretically, thousands of casualties. And we were prepared for extensive special needs in medical service. Frankly, the fact that we won't have that flow of patients doesn't minimize the fact that our very preparedness and therefore our overall services are better now because we had to work to get ready. And I think all veterans, and especially the few casualties that we'll be receiving from the Persian Gulf, will benefit from the fact that we've had 7 months to improve our capabilities, and we've done so.
All right, Mr. Summer, you are a specialist, I guess, on the post-traumatic stress syndrome. Do you expect that this will occur with the Desert Storm veterans?
Well, it is very likely that there will be post-traumatic stress disorder, and particularly those individuals who have been involved in the combat, or, for instance, the people who were hit with the Scud missile yesterday, and many others, some of the medical care workers possibly. However, there is a lot more known now than there was during Vietnam, and it can be taken care of immediately. The individuals can be screened. The Department of Veterans Affairs has put in place a mental health team in each of the 80 primary casualty centers, VA medical centers, consisting of 3 people who will be looking for these symptoms. So fortunately, a lot has been learned and a lot can be done that wasn't done during Vietnam, and it should help in the situation a great deal.
All right, we'll take a short break right here, and we'll return and continue this discussion about the veterans and when they come home. And welcome back. Either of you can answer this. What are the biggest problems that the veterans will face when they come back?
Well, I think this time the veterans are very different. There's 2 types. There's a regular career service person who return to that career. And there'll be adjustments, of course, psychological. They come home to the great welcome we all expect, but they're returning to a continued career. the National Guardsmen and the reservists who've called up will basically be returning to their civilian careers. And so hopefully, contrast to Vietnam, I think Mary would agree, we should have fewer problems of readjustment. So I don't mean to speak for you, Mary.
No, I think that that's true, that we'll have fewer problems. One of the things that struck me the other day, and I hadn't heard this before, is that the average age of those serving in the Persian Gulf is 27. So we have an older group of people. We have some already with some support in place, many of them married and having families. We've heard some of the problems about that. So I think that support, rather than the 19 and 20 and 21-year-olds who are coming home from Vietnam, who kind of went off and there wasn't anything available. Services available within the Veterans Administration for health care needs immediately, for psychological support, are in place and ready to go. And there's legislation, certainly, and intent on the part of the Veterans Administration to bring these people into those programs that already exist. We'd like to see some expansion. We certainly need expansion of the PTSD counseling programs for Vietnam veterans. And we needed that last year. We've needed it for a while. We need to do it now for these people. But I think the readjustment will be easier, certainly. And that has to do with, you don't have to close the door on your experiences and not talk about them, and people are going to want to hear about them. And I hope that we do it in a way that we older veterans don't say, oh, yeah, but it was worse for us. We have to understand that everyone's experience in a war situation is difficult, and it's valuable, and their experience needs to be valued and not overlaid with, well, ours was better or worse. It was just different.
During this conflict, this war, more women are involved than ever before. What does that mean, and what problems do you think that they will have that will be different from the male veterans?
Okay. Well, first of all, what it means is a real change, certainly in our society, and a change in the military forces, and more opportunities for women in the military. When I was in the military, we have all this controversy now about, you know, parents and mothers and fathers going. When I was in the military, you could be married, but if you got pregnant, you were out automatically. You couldn't stay in the military, and a lot of strides have been made in that way. I think that the problems that we're going to see, or many of the problems, when we talk about PTSD, I expect that we will see that among women veterans, and I think that they're going to be more forthcoming to say, I need some help with this, because we've identified it as this is something to be expected. You should expect to have some problems with your war experience. Wherever you are, if you've been sitting in the desert for 7 months, that's also a stressful situation, too, sitting there every night, or the Scud's going to get us, you know, what's happening to my friends. I think one thing that's good here is that these units have gone mostly together, and these people know each other. They've known each other, particularly the reservists, for a long time. There's a lot of support of each other, and there was a lot going on beforehand.
That you didn't have in Vietnam.
Sure, and there was a lot going on beforehand of Vietnam veterans going and talking to these groups before they went about the importance of supporting each other and understanding that. So I think the problem for women veterans, certainly we're going to have, we have injuries. We'll probably have some injuries from women, maybe some illnesses that we don't even know about now. I'm hearing things, you know, because we're in a different part of the world, we don't have the same kind of immunity, none of us do, that the people there have developed over the years. So we may see some things that we didn't expect later on. And the Veterans Administration over the past few years, because of the advice of the VA's Advisory Committee on Women Veterans, has made great strides in providing privacy facilities within VA hospitals, in having programs for women veterans to let them know what services are available. It's going to be much better for them than it is for any women in the past. And I credit certainly the women, the Vietnam generation of women, and particularly women in Vietnam Veterans of America, because we have been the most active. We're getting many more women involved now, but the most active in addressing these issues and bringing them to the forefront, and that's helped all women. The fact is, women have been involved in every conflict this country has ever fought, and we're finally recognizing their service and saying they stand there, do their job well, and they're not asking for special favors, and they never have.
Well, I mean, in fact, our coverage here at CBS, we covered some of the reserve groups going out, and I saw women carrying M16s. Mm-hmm. Which I think they hadn't done before. And I guess they say it's a law that they can't actually get involved in combat or in a combat situation, but they're so close, and with Scud missiles and you never know, you know, exactly where you are.
They basically, by law, cannot be in the combat units, infantry and artillery, or infantry and armor, I think, and maybe artillery, some artillery. But because of the way we fight wars now, very high technology, women are doing all kinds of things, and they are in harm's way. There's no doubt about that. We certainly were in harm's way in Vietnam, and most of us were nurses serving in base camps, but we got rocket and mortar attacks and those kind of things. So I've always felt that women ought to be able to do anything in the military that they are able to do.
I would like to thank you all for joining us here on Night Watch.
Thank you.
And we'll be back, so stay with us. The world will be watching in the wake of the Gulf War to see how that war has affected relations between Israel and the Palestinians. For decades, one of the leading defenders of the Israeli state has been Abba Eban, a former Israeli foreign minister, a scholar, and author. He indicated the depth of the Israeli struggle in a 1957 interview with CBS News correspondent Edward R. Morrow.
A people resumes its nationhood after 2,000 years, recaptures its original land and language, recovers from the death of 6 million of its kinsmen, climbs back into the family of nations. Well, if that's a great theme, as I think it is, it matters greatly how it is expressed. And I've been concerned with trying to express that for the last 8 years.
Abba Eban has also worked within Israel in favor of a negotiated settlement to establish a Palestinian state. Abba Eban joins us from New York to look at how Israel may approach the Palestinian question after the Gulf War. And welcome to you, Mr. Abba Eban.
Thank you very much.
First of all, let's start off. Israel have not even joining in the fight in the Gulf. What has Israel won?
Well, our contribution to the success of the coalition was our willingness to stay out of it. That was most urgently pressed upon us by the United States and others, because if it had become an Israeli-Arab parochial conflict, it would have lost the Arab component completely. And therefore, I believe that our self-imposed unobtrusiveness, although it doesn't really conform with our usual temperament, I think this was very much welcomed. What we want is, as citizens of the world community, is to see the decisive and conspicuous and avowed defeat of Saddam Hussein. There must be a clear picture for the world of his defeat and humiliation. In other words, he must not be allowed to get off with any kind of settlement which can be invoked as proof that he gained anything from this tragic adventure. He is, in fact, one of the greatest enemies that the Iraqi people and the Arab people have ever had, and therefore I believe that the coalition is correct in pushing the military struggle to a clear point of victory.
How difficult was it for Israel to stay out of this conflict? A number of Scud missiles, of course, landed on Israel. How difficult was it for Israel to stay out?
In my opinion, it wasn't difficult at all, because there wasn't any possibility of going in. Those who went around saying that we would or should retaliate never presented any picture of what on earth that would mean. After all, these missile launchers were about 1,000 kilometers away from us. What were we going to do about it? Go through Jordan, go through Saudi Arabia, completely foul up the entire coalition procedure, enter into conflict with the United States, which is leading this effort. In other words, the option of action simply didn't exist, or if it did exist, nobody presented it to us, or insofar as I heard of any scenarios whereby we could take action, they were horrifying in their lack of realism. In fact, there was an objective condition in which the only action that could be taken, and it was taken, was on the one hand the supply to us in Israel of Patriot missiles, and that was a 90% success. As for the rest, to proceed against the missile launchers, that was possible only for the American and British aircraft who were engaged and who had certainly advantages of equipment beyond anything that we had.
Mr. Eban, the world knows that Israel has promised to respond to Iraq's Scud attacks. But with Iraq's armies in shambles, will Israel respond?
Well, first of all, I don't expect there'll be Scud attacks. I don't know where they're going to send them from. But there is nothing at the moment which implies any kind of response. As of this moment, we are satisfied with the action that we have not taken in the past. It's paid off very well. It's secured for us a very great volume of support. I must tell you, it's really a jackpot, because to be praised for something to which you haven't any alternative anyway is a very rare asset for Israel. And since we've often been on the wrong end of justice in this matter, it's very good that we should now be praised. But apart from that, there is nothing whatever to respond to. No, we're not going to.
So that is now clear. You do not think Israel will respond at some later date to those Scud attacks?
I don't believe there are going to be Scud attacks if Saddam isn't around.
Okay, I mean the Scud attacks that occurred. Israel said it would respond to those.
We're not going to respond to those that have already occurred. That's been made quite clear on a bipartisan basis in Israel. There is nothing as of this moment which requires any response by Israel.
All right. Now, prior to this conflict in the Gulf, as you know, Israel has been a very close friend of the United States. But during this conflict, the United States has been fighting alongside of Saudi forces, Kuwaiti forces, Egyptian forces, Syrian forces, and other Arab forces. Has this affected the relations between the United States and Israel?
Well, there have been misunderstandings and there have been divergences of interest. I think that's natural. I've never believed that the United States can give us 100% support. If the United States were to agree with Israel on everything, the United States would have to be right 100% of the time, and we've never expected such rectitude from anybody. But the entry into the United Nations coalition of these Arab governments, that of course does create a problem, and I believe that all my fellow citizens should face it frankly. What it means is that in the future, when the United States deals with Israel, it will have on the back or the front of its mind those to whom it must be grateful for their participation in the coalition, especially Egypt and Saudi Arabia and even Syria. In other words, it's going to be a triangle, not the United States and Israel face to face, but the United States in simultaneous relationship with Israel and with the moderate Arab states. Well, we've had that situation before, but we've had a certain luxury in the past 2 or 3 years during which the United States appeared to attach no importance whatever to its relations in the Arab world, anyway, not overriding importance, and in which it projected right in the forefront its relations with us. Well, that was, as it were, a bonanza for us, and I think we used it well in order to strengthen our resources, to strengthen our defense, but that period is over. In other words, the United States is going to have an Arab policy as well as an Israeli policy, and we'll have to work rather harder than in the past in order to see that our interests are not prejudiced.
All right. We're talking with former Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, and we'll continue this conversation in just a moment.
You're on TV8, KCCI TV, Des Moines. Still to come on Nightwatch, more from Abba Eban. Smokers fight back, a dynamo of dance, and the mysterious world of animals. Now in Washington, here is CBS News correspondent Harold Dow.
And we're talking with former Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban. Mr. Eban, do you think, after the United States, of course, has won the war, do you think that we will win the peace as well in the Middle East?
I think one should be very cautious about promising some kind of utopia, some kind of world order. I even think that the immediate results might be abrasive. You must understand that the United States has led a coalition which has brought enormous power to bear against an Arab state. We must also understand that although the Arab states have diverse interests, I've once said that nothing divides the Arab world more than the attempts to unite it. Nevertheless, they have a kinship, a sense of common blood and pride and tongue and faith and heritage. And therefore, millions of Arabs are at this moment in a rather abrasive and hostile mood to the United States. Some, of course, have suffered directly, as in Iraq. So I don't believe that everybody's going to come around and say, because you've won the war, we regard ourselves as your bosom friends. American diplomacy in the Arab world will have to be a very subtle and complex undertaking. But of course, although somebody once said, I think the Duke of Wellington, that victory is the greatest of all tragedies in war, the fact is that defeat is a much greater tragedy. And if there has to be a war, much better to win it. It does put the United States in a position to exercise its influence, first of all, to avoid a recurrence of wars, and then to get down to an urgent dialogue on outstanding issues which have to be settled, because postponing discussions, such as postponing a discussion on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, has brought us no benefits at all. Time brings nothing but disadvantage. Time makes things worse. Time does not make things better.
All right, as you know, Mr. Abba-Eban, President Bush was emphatic, no linkage. He said that the Iraqis must withdraw from Kuwait unconditionally. But in a funny sort of way, this Palestinian issue, as you just said, will have to be dealt with.
But it must be dealt with in a separate context. It must have its own arena and its own framework and its own timing. It was correct not to deal with it while the attacks were going on by Iraq against Kuwait, and then the counterattacks by the United Nations. It was right not to deal with it in the same forum. The Security Council should have been left exclusively for the discussion of the aggression against Kuwait. It should not have been dealt with by the same people. In other words, it's a specific and special conflict. There are conflicts in Europe, but you don't bring them into the same arena of discussion. You don't discuss Lithuania and Latvia in the same breath and the same context as Iraq and Kuwait. But now that the linkage problem is now at an end, because there's nothing to link anybody to, now is the time when I believe there will be, whether anybody likes it or not, there is going to be an international dialogue and a regional dialogue about the Israeli-Arab and Israeli-Palestinian relationships.
Okay, but would this discussion even be occurring now, or you're talking about they may occur after this conflict is over? Would they occur had this conflict not had started in the first place?
Well, I regard the conflict as over. And I think it would have happened in any case, but it was right not to let it happen in a context which would have given Saddam Hussein to say that he is responsible for the existence of this dialogue. He's not responsible for that. There was a dialogue before. For example, only a few months ago, Secretary Baker made what I thought was a constructive proposal to Israel and to Egypt and to the Palestinians to come together in Cairo simply to talk about how to arrange their relationships. And in a sense, Saddam Hussein had an adverse effect upon the interests of the Palestinians. He made it impossible for that dialogue to go forward. He's therefore the enemy of the Palestinians' interests as well as of those of the Iraqis. But now that he is really being swept away from history in a very magnificent assertion of resistance to aggression, the international decision will be not to let the matters go on the way they were between Israel and the Palestinians and the other Arab states. I think the decision will be to explore actively some progress towards a solution.
What will a post-war Persian Gulf look like?
Well, of course, it's a Persian Gulf in which Iraq has been devastated and humiliated, deservedly, in which Iran will therefore be a much stronger influence, in which Saudi Arabia will have asserted its not only its financial interests, but it did emerge as a considerable strategic power, and in which the principalities in the Gulf will regard themselves as having had their stature raised, this great domination by this bully, by this hooligan. Saddam Hussein would have been lifted off their shoulders. So I believe there will be a flow of oil, there will be cooperation with the West, and there will be a respectful attitude towards the United States and its allies.
How will Syria benefit from all of this, do you think?
Well, Syria had the good sense to be on the winning side, unlike Jordan, which allowed its policies to be somewhat ambivalent.
We'll get to Jordan in a moment.
I believe that Syria is a problem which ought to be explored. We have experience with Syria. I have experience with Syria. I negotiated through Secretary Kissinger a disengagement agreement on the Golan Heights, and the Syrians have meticulously observed and respected that agreement ever since. And whenever there seems to have been a violation, they've moved very quickly to correct it. Therefore, my impression of Assad is as follows. His rhetoric is intolerable, but on the ground, he is capable of the valor of which discretion is the better part, and therefore I think we should pay less attention to his rhetoric and explore the idea of coming to some sort of agreement with Israel, if not a full peace at once. that leads to some kind of unfreezing of hostility.
All right, let's talk about Jordan now. As you know, Jordan's King Hussein somehow or another caught himself between a rock and a hard place, and he sided with Iraq. How do you think Jordan will be affected, and has Jordan lost credibility?
It can't lose credibility. You cannot solve this problem without Jordan. In fact, a Jordanian participation at the center of the peace process was, in my view, inevitable. The most promising moment in Middle Eastern conciliation was when King Hussein and our former Prime Minister, Mr. Peres, with the assistance of former Secretary Schultz, reached an agreement in London on the convening of a meeting in which, after some international auspices, the Jordanians, Israelis, Palestinians, with American good offices, should discuss a solution. We'll have to come back to that because Jordan continues to exist, the Palestinians continue to exist, Israel's existence is absolutely immutable, and therefore these three factors will have to detach themselves from the extraneous and alien context of the Persian Gulf and get back to what I call the Fertile Crescent area, the Mediterranean area. That's where the settlements will have to be made. My prediction is that Hussein will suddenly remember what I call his Sandhurst British orientation, his Western orientation.
Okay.
After all his, and therefore I think he'll say with some justice that he was forced to take these attitudes, just as these unfortunate prisoners who have been presented on your screens, American and British pilots, can say that they were forced to say what they did. In a sense, he had Saddam Hussein's hands around his neck. He was ill-guided, I think, in associating himself with Saddam Hussein. I think he'll find his way back.
All right. A conversation with former Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban will continue in just a moment. Mr. Eban, the Soviet Union, obviously they tried to have some influence with Iraq. What do you see as the outcome of their involvement here in the Middle East?
I think that the overall judgment about the Soviet role should be a positive one. It's true that in the later stages of this drama, they seem to be undercutting the American attitude and the American interest. But if you take the situation as a whole, you get the following picture. Did anybody conceive or believe or imagine a year ago that the Soviet Union would vote for 12 United Nations Security Council resolutions, including a definition of aggression by one of its allies, Iraq, including permission and authorization for the use of force against Iraq, for the condemnation, for the demand for reparations? Who would have believed such things even a year ago? And since without that United Nations cover, the United States and many of the other 29 nations would have found it difficult to proceed, one must say that the contribution of the Soviet Union to the success of this war has been important. You would have liked, and I would have liked, 100% support. All right, it wasn't 100% support, but it was a degree of support without which the entire Desert Sword operation couldn't have occurred. That means that they will be in the picture. In fact, I believe that the proper auspices for a discussion between Israel and the Palestinians and the Jordanians should be the Geneva Conference of 1973, when foreign ministers Kissinger, Gromyko, and I myself took part in that discussion, and we reached very far-reaching agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. I think that an American-Soviet auspices for a discussion between Israel and its Arab neighbors would be the most logical course to pursue.
A Palestinian homeland on the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank, do you think it will ever become a reality?
Well, first of all, let's understand that at the moment it is an area totally separated from Israel. The only link now between Israel and the West Bank and Gaza are our soldiers and our policemen. There is no commerce of ideas, there is no social movement, there is no cooperation. We have less of a place in the West Bank and Gaza than some of the colonial powers used to have in the areas under their rule. In other words, the total separation of the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza from Israel, to the point of even being locked up in their own houses, the most massive incarceration in history. That's one of the results. And therefore nobody in his senses can possibly believe that the status quo can continue without explosion. Now, if you rule out the status quo, there has to be some movement towards at least self-government. I don't say a state at this stage, but self-government certainly. Most of the countries which emerged from foreign rule, from British and French and others, went through a stage of what I would call self-government, and that's what has to happen. That was promised by Mr. Begin to President Sadat in the Camp David agreements. Israel is contractually committed to the withdrawal, I quote from the Camp David agreement, the withdrawal of its military administration, the withdrawal of its civil administration, the establishment of self-government, full autonomy. That's not what I'm saying, I'm just quoting what Mr. Begin signed in the name of Israel in the historic agreement, which still is by Knesset law a part of our jurisprudence. I think we should take it up from there. In other words, you can't have a situation where the rights are distributed in the West Bank and Gaza as follows: 100% for Israelis and 0% for the Palestinians. The world isn't built like that now, least of all after the great democratic wind that has blown over Eastern Europe. This generation is not hospitable to coercive jurisdictions. Therefore, there must be an unfreezing, and the best way would be to take the Camp David proposals as the starting point. The Camp David agreement doesn't give the Palestinians a state. It doesn't deny them that. It doesn't close the possibility. It does create an intermediate situation in which they run their own affairs, with Israel looking only after its security interests. I think we should negotiate that kind of agreement now. And the pressure to do that from world opinion, and I would imagine from Israeli opinion, will be very great.
Well, Mr. Eban,
if you ask me why the status quo isn't feasible, because at the end of this status quo of 100% rule over them, one can see an Arab-Israeli war based on the Palestine question, with world opinion not on our side. Not on our side, because the number of states which believe that the West Bank and Gaza should be permanently incorporated in Israel, do you know what that number is? It is 0.
You say 0, but
zero.
But there are those in the present Israeli government who feel, because of the Scud attacks on Israel, that they won't be safe. They must keep the West Bank and Gaza Strip.
Yes, but the West Bank and Gaza contributed nothing whatever to our safety. Nothing whatever. On the contrary, if the Scuds had been located in the West Bank and Gaza, they couldn't have acted at all, because we could have got hold of them. In other words, the fact the West Bank and Gaza played no role whatever in the Scud issue. What did play a role was that Iraq was far away, but that was beneficial to the Scud campaign. If, let's say, there were Scuds in Nablus, Ramallah, Gaza, they couldn't be there for 10 minutes. We wouldn't have, what difficulty would we have of getting there and taking them away?
All right.
None whatever.
All right, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Abba Eban. We're talking to Abba Eban, the former Israeli foreign minister. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Eric Hawkins is no ordinary choreographer, a winner of the biggest prize in choreography, the Samuel H. Scripps Award. Hawkins' work stands apart from the mainstream of contemporary dance. His dance philosophy is unlike any other in choreography. It includes a spiritual component that is aimed at enlightening the audience. Eric Hawkins' Dance Company is now in its 40th season, and it is celebrating that milestone with a series of performances at the Kennedy Center here in Washington. At 82, Eric Hawkins is still going strong despite a recent stroke. We're pleased to have him join us. Welcome. Tell us a little bit about what you do. You've been involved with choreography for how many years now?
Yes, but first I was a dancer, and it's only a few years ago that I stopped dancing. The the last big work I did when I danced myself was the 350th celebration of Harvard's founding, and I did a dance called Ahab from Moby Dick, and I wish I could do that again, but life goes on, and you can't dance forever.
All right, you said you just stopped dancing a few years ago, but let's bring our audience up to date here. You're 82 years old.
Yes.
And you just stopped a few years ago?
About 3.5 years ago, yes. Yes, that's right. Well, we did some performances of Harvard. We did it at Kennedy Center, too. I can't remember what year. It was a very special dance of mine because I've loved Moby Dick, and to make a whole work of art in modern choreography about a man who had a wooden leg. I need to tell you, Ahab has a wooden leg, and I had a strange device of just having the white leg and white shoe, and that it worked very well.
All right, and you also were the recipient of one of the highest awards that can be given. Your feelings about that?
Well, it's very nice to be honored. But but you don't do it just for the honor, I don't think. At least I don't think so. You do it because you love the work. And so I wouldn't give anyone's life. I've had my troubles, but I wouldn't give anyone's life to change places with them. I would love to make new movement. I was very bright when I was a young man because I knew that a great injustice had been done in America, and I dug for the life of John Brown to mold that into a work of art that could be done on the stage. And I'm very proud of the dance.
Let's take a look at it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. Okay.
John Brown. Because you took 11 Missouri slaves, hiding them in the hills and caves and the rivers and bonds of freedom, and set them free in Canada, the president has priced the bounty of your head.
Not believing in the law of disgrace and barbarity, I know this American sin must be paid with love and pity made of blood.
Now, you said you did that back in the 40s. Was it controversial to do something like that? Particularly portraying John Brown.
Well, it wasn't controversial. It was one section of how the dance art could be. Why I'm very proud of that dance is that it was a subject that needed to be brought to consciousness of people. And I think today, young people are not, in general, are not aware of what went on with John Brown in the Civil War. Well, it is beautiful. We looked out of Kennedy Center and saw the Lincoln Memorial, and tears came to my eyes because I thought, here was a man who was born of very humble parentage, but who had such a strong conviction of human justice that I don't know whether he was right to fight the Civil War or not. Some of the people at the time said, don't shed the blood. But other people said, like John Brown said, it must be righted. And I don't know who was right. Whether Lincoln was tried to avoid the Civil War, or whether John Brown and the abolitionists said, no, you cannot stand, well, like the text says, you cannot stand that injustice. And so I'm very proud of the dance.
But you take on these serious issues, and you do so because you feel it's right. Is that?
Yes. But on the other hand, I've not done many dances like John Brown. Mostly their art in just the pure movement experience.
Well, Eric Hawkins, we wish you much success and a long, long career from here.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. And Night Watch will continue in a moment.
This is KCCI, TV8 in Des Moines.
Still to come on Night Watch, the desperate people of Iraq, smoking and civil rights, and understanding the animal kingdom. Now in Washington, here is CBS News correspondent Harold Dow.
Smoking is not only hazardous to your physical health, it can hurt your job prospects as well. A majority of American companies now restrict smoking in the workplace, and some go even further, refusing to hire smokers at all. Lawmakers in more than 24 state legislatures say that may be going too far. A bill in New Jersey, for example, would treat smokers like any other minority group and protect them from discrimination by employers. Governor Jim Florio vetoed the bill, but an override effort is underway. Two people that'll be joining us this morning will take a look at the New Jersey measure. They are Willie Brown. He is a Democratic assemblyman in New Jersey. He is co-sponsor of the Smokers' Rights Protection Bill, and Dr. William Tansey is a cardiologist and president of the New Jersey branch of the American Heart Association. He has worked with Governor Florio on smokers' rights issues. I'd like to welcome both of you gentlemen to Night Watch. First of all, let's start with you, Assemblyman Willie Brown. Should smokers have rights?
Oh, yes, I think smokers should have rights, just like anyone else. I'm not suggesting to what degree and what level, but I think they have the rights just like any other employee they should have on a job.
What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Tansey?
I certainly agree with Assemblyman Brown about people having rights, and I think Assemblyman Brown has distinguished himself in cherishing people's rights. But to establish what is well known internationally as a self-destructive habit with the wrappings of civil rights, to protect it the same way as you do race, creed, national origin, marital status, and sex, seems to trifle with those much more serious issues. And I think our contest from the American Heart Association, since our effort has been in the direction of protecting people's well-being, is to be careful about what is now a nationwide initiative by the tobacco industry to cast the smoking habit as a cherished right and put it up there with some of our highest privileges.
All right, let's first of all take a look at the bill. Willie Brown, you introduced it.
Oh, that's right, in the Assembly. Yes.
Would you please tell us about it? What does it say?
Basically, all the bill says is that an employer does not have the right to discriminate individual or potential employee from hiring, from having a job. What we have taken place in New Jersey, there are certain companies that are now advertising for jobs, and they're indicating that only non-smokers should apply. Smokers need not apply. And that, to me, immediately goes back to the 60s when there were other kinds of signs in the 50s when people were denied employment. So I think those kinds of practices need to be looked at very well. My main concern is that my constituents that I represent, a lot of them are on the lower social economic scale. I think you will find that most people, the majority of smokers in that category tend to smoke. And I can see that as a mechanism for continued discrimination, to deny people jobs for other reasons, but using smoking as an excuse. So that's the concern that I have, and that's why I felt this legislation is needed.
We understand also that some employers actually prohibit people not only from smoking on the workplace, but even if they were caught smoking in a movie theater, in their automobiles, they wouldn't get the job as well?
Oh, absolutely. What the legislation says, we are not trying to take away the employer's rights to prohibit smoking on the job. You know, the employer should have that opportunity, that right. But if a person just happens to be a smoker at home, and not to hire that person or fire that person because they smoke at home or in a theater, that's what the legislation addressed, and that's where my concerns are.
What's wrong with that, Dr. Tansey?
Well, as a practicing physician, I have to emphasize I'm a zealot for privacy. That's the one thing I'm a zealot for. But when it comes to the management of the issue of smoking, if tobacco were introduced to the marketplace today, it wouldn't last but 24 hours, because it is without a doubt the most deadly chemical. It kills more Americans than auto accidents, alcohol, and AIDS combined. It's a really deadly product, but by the accident of history that it is still legal, it still is something that people choose to do. Now, we in the American Heart Association, we're not attacking smokers, we're not after smokers. As it happens, 90% of smokers want to stop smoking, and what we do the best is help people out of being attached to that. Now, in Mr. Brown's area, that's a population that has been addressed by the smoking industry, and because of some of the initiatives on our efforts, a lot of the seduction has been removed, the billboards have been removed, the actual open handing out of cigarettes to kids has been removed. But now, what's the next agenda? Well, the next agenda is for the tobacco companies to say, well, let's wrap this thing, let's wrap this rogue in the clothing of civil rights, because everybody cherishes civil rights. And that's the problem as I see it. With this thing is, like Lewis Carroll said, things are not always what they seem. On the surface, this is a plea for privacy, and that's what people are after. We protect our privacy. Don't tell us what we can do at home. But recognize, at the same time, you're sanctifying something that you know accounts for a major portion of this nation's health debt. Know that you're dealing with the thing that accounts for the major amount of downtime in industry.
All right, we should let Willie Brown answer that. Is the tobacco industry itself really the ones behind this that are trying to...
Well, I'm not suggesting the tobacco industry is behind it, not behind it, but I think that I'm opposed. First of all, I don't smoke, and I'm against smoking. I know how detrimental smoking could be. I would support legislation that would address that issue. This legislation does not address that issue, and I would argue that people stand more of a chance of having a heart attack with the fact they are smokers than to go to find out they have lost their jobs. They're only going to smoke more, you know, because they've become more frustrated. So I'm suggesting that the veto does not address the problem. I would support legislation that would address the problem. And we need to have a mechanism to protect people's rights from working. You know, the fact that they have been discriminated against for employment is really my concern. I think that's what we have to address. I'm not suggesting what degree that it should be as it relates to civil rights. I think there is a need to have some legislation attacked to protect those individuals. You know, the fact that we tax cigarettes. I mean, if tobacco is so bad, then we should make it illegal to sell tobacco. We shouldn't... A lot of our revenue comes from tobacco, so it's an accepted social practice in society. You know, if it's that bad, then let's do away with it.
Okay, both of you gentlemen, please stay with us. Night Watch will continue in just a moment, and we'll continue this discussion about smokers' rights. And we're continuing our discussion on smokers' rights. Assemblyman Brown, wouldn't
let me make a point, you know, in reference to, I'd be curious to find out, I know a lot of doctors smoke, a lot of them smoke cigars. How many of them would feel comfortable if they went to the hospital and the hospital said you can no longer practice medicine here because you're a smoker? You know, I mean, you know, those are people involved. I'd be curious to find out their position.
You've had a chance to think about that one, Dr. Tansey. Why don't you answer that?
You know, I think that this issue has to be dealt with. not at the level of a civil right. This is written in a civil rights code for which there's no exclusion.
Well, is it a health issue or is it a civil rights issue? Or is it both?
It's a, from my point of view, as a practicing doc, it's a health issue. I mean, I deal on a daily basis with people. I mean, the Coop's statistics show that 4 out of 5 people who smoke want to stop smoking. I could verify that from my practice. I want to help people get off of tobacco. I understand that some people are addicted to tobacco. I understand they need help, and that's why the American Heart Association is there to help people not smoke. But when you look at the statistics, over the last 10 years, the death from cardiovascular diseases in the nation has dropped 25%. Now, one of the most powerful tools in all of that is prevention. And I would like to boast that the American Heart accounts for a lot of that effort with all our volunteers. So we're out there teaching people that this substance is going to increase your chance of a stroke by 5, increase your chance of a heart attack by 3. And yet at the same time we're teaching this to the kids in the school with our school site initiatives, our assembly is saying, well, smoking is a civil right. It sounds wrong. It doesn't feel right. I mean, I understand people's need of choice, and when I speak to a patient, I don't say, listen, if you don't stop smoking, I'll never see you again. I say, listen, here's some tricks. Here's some, understand, if you're going to smoke at home, you're making a choice, but understand the choice you're making. So while I'm making all this preventive health initiative, I'm countered by my biggest adversary, or the Heart Association's biggest adversary, is the Tobacco Institute, which spends $10 million a day marketing the most deadly product that our nation has.
See, then I think if that's the case, then we should talk about legislation that prohibits marketing. I mean, we should talk about legislation that addresses those issues, which I don't have any real problems with. My thing is that's discrimination. I don't think we should have the kids growing up to say that, you can be denied of a job based on various social practice when they know that the most detrimental thing is probably using illegal drugs, cocaine and things of that nature. There are no ads in the paper saying drug addicts need not apply, but they're singling out smokers. And I would question that if we all agree that there are social problems, but we need to come together collectively and figure out how to address that. This legislation, does not deal with any of those things that you talked about, which I would support. We could talk about a way to arrive at that.
Let's talk for a second about what the tobacco companies are trying to cast themselves as. As you know, the protectors of liberty, as an example, the Philip Morris Company recently ran a series of ads embracing the Constitution. Do you think that that set the stage for what's happening right now in New Jersey and other state legislatures?
I don't think the two are related. I think I think any company would embrace the Constitution. The fact that they're business practicing in this country, that's what the whole capitalistic society is about.
But I mean, visually implying that you have a constitutional right to smoke.
Well, I think you do until we do a constitutional amendment to say you don't have. I would think that people have a right to do whatever. That's the right of privacy. I think it created that. People have a right to drink alcohol, but there's no sign saying because you drink alcohol, you will not be hired. So it's a question, where do we stop? The alcohol industry probably would do the same thing, I guess. I haven't seen them, embrace
Do you agree with that, Dr. Tansey, that you have a constitutional right to smoke?
I think you have a constitutional right to do what you want to do. I don't think at this time you need to select out one substance. You talk about alcohol, you talk about smoking, talk about eating ice cream. That's cholesterol containing. Are we going to make a law that says you can't eat ice cream at home? No, we're not saying that. We're saying, and I'll repeat, that the difference between the drugs and the tobacco is the drugs are illegal, the tobacco by accident of history is legal.
Which is the fallacy that if that's the problem, that's what we need to correct.
Well, I can certainly agree with that.
Maybe we need to talk about a constitutional amendment to make smoking illegal.
The tobacco industry is the only unregulated industry in our country.
Okay, what happened here? There was a tremendous effort to get people to stop smoking, and it seems now the pendulum is swinging the other way. What's happening?
I think there's still an effort. I support the effort to get people to stop smoking because I know it's detrimental. I personally don't like smoke, and I like, to be around smokers. So I can, I empathize with people as a smoker rights. We support, employers, non-smoking. We passed legislation, no smoking in public places. I was a proponent. I supported that position. I still do. But I think it's two different issues.
Do you think that some employers and companies have crossed the line when they say, we won't hire you?
Absolutely.
Is that your
Absolutely. That's my concern, and I see that as a mechanism to continue discrimination that I've experienced, and a lot of my constituents have experienced down through the years, and there's nothing to protect them. If we could come up with some kind of legislation to protect those individuals, then I'll be satisfied.
All right, we have 30 seconds, gentlemen. What will happen? Will Governor Florio's measure, will it be overridden in New Jersey?
I'm in a position now to try to work out a solution so that everyone can be on board and everyone can be supportive of the legislation, including the Heart Association and all those other smoker rights, the citizens that smoke. As long as they're all protected, then I have no problem. That's my objective.
Okay. We'll be right back in just a moment. Please stay with us.